On the Kessler family's big day, every eye turned to Camille, the beautiful younger sister who had just married Preston Vance, a man who stepped out of a gleaming sports car, pockets full, and wearing the easy smile of someone who had never known want. But Josephine, the 27-year-old eldest daughter whose hands were rough from night shifts and the weight of her father's hospital bills, stood quietly beside the husband her whole family pitied. Elias, a poor farmer from Hollow Creek who arrived in a rusted old pickup, with no dowry and not a single word of show. Her mother sneered. The relatives hid their laughter, and her father sighed that she had chosen poverty for the rest of her life with her own hands. Amid all the humiliation, Josephine only sat up straight, not shedding a single tear, and softly replied, "A man is not the car he drives." Not one soul in that room could have guessed that the man in the old pickup was quietly watching them all, and that the secret he carried, once revealed, would make this entire family pay for every scornful glance. If you want to know Elias's secret and how Josephine's fate will change, hit like and share this video right now. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the surprising episodes to come. When the wedding reception moved into the part of the evening when guests raised their glasses, when the music softened and people began gathering around the bride's family table, Patricia finally found the opportunity she had been waiting for. She picked up the small velvet box the Marchetti family had just given Josephine, turned it over beneath the lights, and laughed aloud, loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Inside lay an old onyx ring, its silver tarnished, and its dark stone holding not so much as a glimmer. Patricia said that in this day and age, she had never seen anyone offer a piece of junk like that as a wedding gift. Camille, over there, had been given a brand new necklace in a box, stamped with gold lettering, while her eldest daughter had received something even a pawn shop wouldn't bother looking at. The aunts seated nearby covered their mouths and laughed again, and someone whispered that the groom's family must be so poor they couldn't afford anything respectable. Josephine remained seated, her hands resting in her lap, the familiar calluses hidden beneath the fabric of a wedding dress borrowed from an acquaintance. She didn't answer. She merely closed her fingers more tightly around the box, as though afraid someone might snatch it away. And just as the air became almost too difficult to breathe, Vera, her mother-in-law, sitting upright with a calm and steady gaze, slowly set her glass of water on the table. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't flush with anger. She simply looked Patricia directly in the eyes and said that the ring had accompanied her family's great-grandmother through the hungriest years of her life, when an entire harvest had failed and the man of the house had died. That woman had raised 4 children alone with nothing but her own 2 hands, and the ring had never left her finger, even on nights when the whole family went without food. Vera said the stone was dark because it had witnessed more than any new piece of jewelry could ever understand. Then she turned her eyes toward Josephine and lowered her voice. "We gave it to our daughter-in-law because Josephine is worthy of that kind of strength, not of a light that only knows how to sparkle for a few seasons." The entire table fell silent for several heartbeats. Patricia pressed her lips together, unable to find a single word in reply, while Camille sat beside her new husband, unconsciously twisting the gold necklace around her finger as though, for the first time, it no longer carried the weight she had imagined it did. At the far end of the room, leaning against a wall where the paint had begun to peel, Elias had remained silent all this time. He didn't step forward to defend his wife. He didn't say a word. He only watched the way Josephine refused to bow her head beneath the ridicule, the way she refused to let even one tear fall although her shoulders had begun to tremble ever so slightly. And in his gray-blue eyes accustomed to reading a person at a single glance, something softened, as though he had finally found exactly what he had come here to find. Few among the Kessler relatives questioned why a family drowning in debt would agree to marry their eldest daughter to a farmer with no house and no car, because they had all heard the same simple answer. The man had asked for no dowry at all. Instead, he had quietly paid a portion of the crushing hospital bills for her father, who now lay bedridden. To Patricia, it was a bargain, a convenient way to rid herself of the daughter she had always regarded as a burden. To Josephine, it was the only path that allowed her father to continue receiving treatment. No one bothered to ask how a poor man like Elias had possessed that much money. No one noticed that he hadn't simply drifted into Hollow Creek by chance, as the rumors claimed. A few months before the name Elias first appeared in the area, an unfamiliar car had sat for a long time across the road, leading to the cannery where Josephine worked the night shift, and the man inside had watched the Kessler family far longer than any hurried marriage could explain. When the reception was nearly over, and the guests began leaving one by one, Vera walked over and placed a hand on Josephine's shoulder. Softly, she told her that she didn't need to prove anything to people who could see only the surface. Then she glanced toward her son with a look only the two of them understood, and Josephine, still clutching the velvet box in her slender hands, felt for the first time that day that someone in the room had truly seen her, though she had no idea that the silent man leaning against the wall carried a secret powerful enough to overturn everything. The old pickup turned onto the dirt road leading back to Hollow Creek after the sky had already faded to the color of lead. Elias shut off the engine and sat motionless for several seconds before saying that he didn't want her to expect too much. The house had been abandoned for a long time, and he had never had the time to repair it. Josephine looked through the window and saw a sagging porch roof, a broken window frame covered temporarily with a piece of cardboard, and she merely replied that she had spent many years living in a place where they had to set buckets all over the floor whenever it rained, so she wasn't afraid of unfinished houses. She was only afraid of houses no one wanted to come home to. Elias turned and looked at her longer than necessary before opening the door and stepping out of the truck. On their first night, she spread the blanket she had brought from her mother's house over the old mattress, heated a kettle of water on a gas stove with one broken burner, then sat on the front step drinking watered-down coffee. Elias asked whether she regretted it. She asked what she was supposed to regret. He said everything she had heard the day before, her mother, her aunts, the look on her father's face when she climbed into his pickup. Josephine was silent for a while, then said that she had been hearing words like those since she was 17, that some words could bring people to their knees only because they believed them, but she didn't. She said she hadn't married him to prove anything to anyone, and he didn't owe her a beautiful house. The man sitting a short distance away, his elbows resting on his knees, gave her no answer. He only stared down at the dark ground. The next morning, when he woke, the kitchen had been cleaned. The chairs with broken legs had been braced with scraps of wood. The cardboard covering the window had been replaced with an old pane of glass she had obtained from the elderly woman who lived in the last house down the road. And 2 cups of coffee stood on the table beside a plate of eggs. He remained in the doorway, watching her struggle to wipe the dust from the lampshade, turning it slightly so the light would fall into the center of the room, instead of gathering in one corner. He asked why she was doing that. She said that when light was placed properly, the whole room felt warmer, and it didn't cost another penny. Elias laughed, a dry, brief sound, as though he himself were surprised that he had laughed at all. In the days that followed, she rose before dawn, carried a portion of their food to the elderly neighbor who lived alone, gathered branches people had thrown away along the edges of their gardens, and planted them in the patch of earth before the porch. When he asked where she found the strength to do so much after spending years carrying everyone else's burdens, she replied that once a person became accustomed to working to pay off debts, working for a home of her own felt far lighter. One afternoon, he came home early and found her standing in the kitchen, her hair tied back in haste, her sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of soup. He didn't speak. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down. She turned around with a start and asked why he wasn't saying anything. He answered that he simply liked sitting there and watching her work. She stood still for several seconds, then lowered her head to hide the warmth rising across her cheeks, and said that no one in her family had ever sat down merely to watch her cook. They had only waited for her to put the food on the table. During dinner that evening, he asked what she had once wanted to do when she was younger. She said she had studied nursing for 2 years and had once imagined herself wearing white and caring for people, until her father collapsed and the whole family turned toward her as though she were a life preserver. She spoke with perfect calm, without resentment, but the spoon in her hand remained motionless for a long time. Elias looked at her and said that something a person had been forced to leave behind wasn't necessarily lost forever. She gave a faint smile and told him he didn't speak like a farmer. He fell silent for exactly 1 beat, then replied that people who enjoyed reading could be found anywhere. That weekend, she placed a glass jar filled with wildflowers on the windowsill, shifted the dining table into the path of the morning sunlight, and set the velvet box containing the onyx ring in the highest place in the house, as though it were the most precious thing she owned. When Elias came inside in the middle of the afternoon, he stopped at the threshold longer than usual and looked around the house that only a few weeks earlier had been cold and empty, but now held the scent of food, light placed exactly where it belonged, and the sound of a woman humming softly in the kitchen. In that moment, something very much like remorse passed across the face of a man unaccustomed to showing emotion, because he knew perfectly well that this house wasn't where he belonged, and the wife who was turning it into a home still had no idea whom she had married. The first call came at nearly 2 in the morning. Josephine woke not because of a ringtone, but because of the phone vibrating again and again against the wooden tabletop. She heard Elias's footsteps moving quietly toward the porch, then the screen door closing so gently that it seemed he had long since learned how to keep it from making a sound. She lay still in the darkness, and through the narrow opening in the doorway, she heard his voice. It wasn't the voice he used when asking what she wanted for breakfast. It was something entirely different, low and flat, without the slightest rise or fall. The voice of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than answering them. He said that he had already told them never to call this line unless the docks were burning. His voice was laced with a lethal calm that made the night air freeze. He ordered them to let the contraband shipment pass without firing a single shot, adding in a bone-chilling whisper, "If anyone bleeds before I give the mark, I will personally strip their rank." After another stretch of silence, he asked for the name of the person guaranteeing the account. Then he listened again, and the final thing he said before ending the call was, "Let him believe he's still safe." When he came back inside, Josephine had already closed her eyes. She heard him stand at the foot of the bed for a long while. He didn't lie down. He simply stood there, then went back outside and remained on the porch until morning. The next day, she set a cup of coffee in front of him and asked whether he had managed to sleep. He replied that someone from his old workplace had called with questions about some paperwork. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. She only told him that if something was keeping him awake, he shouldn't sit alone on the porch because it was cold out there. On the nights that followed, the calls came again, sometimes at 1 in the morning, sometimes close to 4, and every time they did, he went outside to the porch, while every time they did, she remained motionless in bed. Once, she heard more clearly than ever. He said that the man didn't have enough capital to play this game, that the money he was spending wasn't his own, and that he wanted to know exactly who was standing behind him. Then he paused and added something that made her heart slow for a single beat. He said the man had just married into a family in the area, which meant he would remain there long enough. Josephine didn't understand everything she had heard, but she understood enough to know that the man sitting outside on the porch wasn't merely a farmer dealing with old paperwork. One afternoon, while Elias was changing out of the sweat-soaked work shirt he had draped over the back of a chair, a small object slipped from the pocket, rolled twice across the floor, and came to rest beneath the table. Josephine bent down to pick it up, and the moment she did, she went still. It was a signet ring, heavy in the hand, made of dark metal, its face engraved with a symbol she had never seen before. It wasn't the sort of jewelry sold at a county market, and it wasn't something a man living in a house with cardboard covering the windows should have owned. She held it in her rough fingers and felt its weight, a weight that didn't belong in this place. Elias stepped into the room and saw the ring in her hand. He stopped where he stood, and for exactly 3 breaths, his face returned to a coldness she had never seen during all the weeks they had spent together. Those gray-blue eyes studied her as though weighing something of consequence. Then, just as quickly, they softened. He walked toward her, held out his hand, and said that the ring had belonged to his father. Josephine placed it in his palm. Her fingers brushed his, and she noticed that his hand wasn't trembling at all. She told him it was beautiful. He answered that it was old. She looked at him for 1 more second, then turned back toward the stove and said lunch was almost ready. She didn't ask why a farmer carried something so heavy in the pocket of his work shirt. She didn't ask why he never wore it. She didn't ask about the calls that came at 2 in the morning. That evening, as they sat together over dinner, he was the one who finally broke the silence. He asked why she hadn't questioned him. Josephine set down her bowl and said that she had spent her entire life in a house where people interrogated one another all day long, though no one truly wanted to hear the answers. She said she didn't want to live that way anymore. If there was something he needed her to know, he would tell her. And if he hadn't told her yet, then he probably wasn't ready. She added that she only hoped that when he finally did speak, it wouldn't be something that made her regret trusting him. Elias looked at her for a very long time, so long that she thought he was finally going to tell her something. For one moment, his lips parted, but then the phone on the table began to vibrate again. An unsaved name appeared on the screen. He turned the phone face down, rose from his chair, and said he needed to step outside for a while. When the screen door closed behind him, Josephine remained alone in the quiet kitchen she had warmed with her own hands, and for the first time, she felt that there was a darkness inside this house that she had no way to illuminate. The man arrived late one afternoon, walking in from the beginning of the dirt road instead of driving all the way to the house. He was tall, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, and his dark coat was far too well tailored for this part of the country. He introduced himself as Gideon, Elias's cousin, and said he had been passing through and decided to stop by. Josephine invited him inside, poured coffee, and set out a plate of cakes she had just baked. As she stood beside the stove, she heard Gideon ask Elias how the farm work had been going lately, and there was something very strange in his voice, as though the two men were performing a play whose lines only they knew. When she brought the coffee over, Gideon looked slowly around the kitchen and said the place was much warmer than he had imagined. Then he glanced at Elias and added that there were places where people poured in enormous amounts of money and still couldn't drive out the cold, while other places needed only one person who knew how to turn a house into a true home. Josephine smiled and said he was giving her too much credit, then excused herself to finish hanging the laundry outside. The moment the screen door closed behind her, Gideon's voice changed completely. He lowered it and said that 3 shipments in a row had gone off course. It wasn't an error. Someone on the inside was passing the schedules out. The other side had known in advance about changes that only a few people within the family had been told, which meant the traitor wasn't standing outside. He was sitting at the same table. Elias showed no surprise. He merely asked where the money was flowing. Gideon said it passed through 3 accounts before ending up in a shell construction company based there, a company that had never built so much as a single wall, and the man whose name appeared on the paperwork was Preston Vance. Elias was silent for a moment, then said Preston was only the hand, not the mind. A man who spent money the way Preston did was never the man controlling it. He was only a place where someone else washed it clean. Gideon nodded and said that was also why he had warned Elias against this from the beginning. If all they needed was to discover whose money Preston was laundering, none of this should have been necessary. A man in Elias's position shouldn't have had to spend months living in a leaking house, driving a pickup no one back home would dare sit in, and marrying a woman whose entire family looked at him as though he were a beggar. Elias replied that a man heard more from close by than he ever could from a distance. Preston would never guard himself against a farmer who had married into the same family. He would speak freely in front of him, boast, and reveal things he would have hidden until his dying breath if Elias had arrived under his true name. Gideon looked at him and said he wasn't arguing with any of that. What he wanted to ask was something else. When Elias chose to marry into this family, had he expected the woman sitting in that kitchen to be the kind of person she was? Elias didn't answer at once. He looked through the window, fitted with the old pane of glass Josephine had found to replace the cardboard, watched her shadow moving in the yard as she folded the clothes, and said that he had accounted for everything except that. The women he had known before had come to him only after learning who he was, but she had agreed to marry a man who appeared to have nothing at all. And now, every morning, she made coffee for him without knowing that the man sitting across from her could buy the entire town outright. Gideon set down his cup and said Elias had to tell her. He had to tell her now, before things went too far, because some truths became distorted the longer they were kept hidden. At first, the truth was merely a secret. Then it became a lie. In the end, it became betrayal in the eyes of the person who had been deceived. Elias said he would tell her. Gideon asked when, and after a long silence, Elias answered with only 3 words, "When I'm certain." Gideon studied him for a long time, then said he knew exactly what Elias was trying to be certain of. He wasn't afraid she wouldn't love him. He was afraid of himself, afraid that if he told her too soon, he would never know whether she stayed because of him or because of the Marchetti name. Gideon added that Elias wouldn't be the one to pay the price for waiting. She would. At that exact moment, Josephine pushed open the door and came inside carrying a basket of dry laundry. Both men fell silent at once. She looked from one to the other, then smiled and said they must be discussing men's business, and that she would go warm the food. Gideon rose and said he had to leave. When he reached the doorway, he turned back toward her and said very quietly that she was a wonderful cook, and that he hoped she would still want to cook for the man sitting there when the time came. Josephine didn't understand what he meant. She only smiled and walked him all the way to the end of the lane. Elias remained seated alone in the brightly lit kitchen, one hand clenched tightly around the signet ring in his coat pocket, knowing that the clock had begun to run, and that every day he remained silent was another day he owed that woman a little more. Camille arrived on a weekend morning, leaving her car at the beginning of the dirt road because she didn't want mud splashing onto the wheels. She crossed the yard in high heels that sank into the earth, her searching gaze sweeping over every corner of the house. She said she had stopped by because their mother insisted someone should see how Josephine was living, so the family wouldn't be accused of abandoning her. Then she sat on the chair, whose broken leg had been braced with scraps of wood, and carefully smoothed her dress to keep it from wrinkling. Josephine poured coffee, set a plate of still warm cakes in front of her sister, and asked after Preston. Camille replied that he was extremely busy, that every project seemed to need him, and that some weeks he traveled through several cities without stopping. She spoke like someone reciting a line she had memorized, rather than describing her own life. Then she fell silent and looked around, and it was that silence more than anything else that made her uncomfortable, because she had arrived with a picture already fixed in her mind: a worn and exhausted older sister, a cold and miserable house, a woman who would burst into tears and begin pouring out her suffering the moment a blood relative walked through the door. Instead, she found a bright pane of glass fitted into the window, a jar of wildflowers on the sill, the scent of baking drifting from the kitchen, and the sister their entire family had mocked, sitting across from her with relaxed shoulders and a face untouched by makeup, yet illuminated by something Camille couldn't name. She asked whether Josephine felt sad having to live like this. Josephine said she didn't have much, but what she did have belonged to her. Camille laughed and said she sounded like one of those phrases people hung on the wall to make themselves feel less miserable. Then she asked where Josephine had found the money to replace the window, and where the money came from for all the food and baking supplies in the kitchen. Josephine replied that the old woman at the end of the road had given her the glass, and that she bought the flour with the wages she earned helping in the kitchen at a restaurant outside town. Camille nodded thoughtfully, but her attention had already settled elsewhere: on the work boots beside the door with their thick leather and solid stitching, on the telephone lying face down on the table, on the strange way everything in the house was poor but nothing was neglected. She asked where her brother-in-law was. Josephine said he had gone to the fields early. Camille remarked that it was strange, because someone at the tavern outside town had said a gleaming black car had been seen parked along the main road, and that a man had stepped out of it and spoken to Elias for a very long time, though it was Elias who stood listening, not the other man. She added that people were also saying Elias had paid a large portion of their father's hospital expenses outright, without borrowing from anyone, and in a voice sweet as sugar, she asked where a farmer could possibly have found that much money. Josephine set down her cup and told her not to listen to gossip from a tavern. Camille laughed and said she merely found it curious, but in that moment, something began to stir inside her. Not curiosity, but fear, because all her life she had been taught that she was the beautiful one, the chosen one, the daughter who would change the family's fortunes, while Josephine was the one who carried the burdens, the one who stayed behind, the one who endured without complaint. That order had been the only thing that ever made Camille feel superior. Yet now she was sitting in a leaking house with a gold necklace around her throat, and a husband who hadn't come home for dinner in a month, while the sister in the faded dress possessed something she did not: peace. And if the farmer truly wasn't as simple as he appeared, if there was something hidden behind that rusted pickup, then it meant she had chosen wrongly even in the final hand she believed she had won. The thought tightened in her throat. She rose and wandered around the room as though by chance, stopping before the highest place on the wall where Josephine had displayed the velvet box. She asked whether it was the old ring from the wedding. Josephine said it was. Camille reached up and took it down, opened the box, turned the dark stone beneath the light, and said that when one looked closely, it did possess a certain presence. Then she asked whether Josephine's mother-in-law treated her well. Josephine replied that Vera had been very kind to her. Camille closed the box and returned it to its place, though her fingers lingered for one extra beat against the velvet. Then she said she had heard the Marchetti family would be holding a large family gathering at the end of the month, that their mother had been invited, and that their mother had told Camille she must come along for the sake of appearances. Josephine looked surprised and said no one had mentioned it to her. Camille smiled and replied that they had invited their mother first because, after all, she was Elias's mother-in-law. She lifted her purse onto her shoulder, and when she reached the door, she turned back, looked Josephine slowly from head to toe, and said that Josephine shouldn't blame her for speaking honestly, but 9 times out of 10, when a man hid money from his wife, he was hiding something much larger. After Camille's car disappeared beyond the dirt road, Josephine remained standing in the kitchen she had warmed with her own hands, staring at the velvet box on the wall, and for the first time, it seemed no longer to rest exactly where she had placed it. Camille, meanwhile, sat behind the wheel with both hands gripping it tightly. And in her mind, the Marchetti family gathering at the end of the month began to take shape with perfect clarity, like a door that had just opened the smallest crack. The gathering at the end of the month was held at Vera's large house on the edge of Hollow Creek, an old wooden home far grander than anything Patricia had imagined, and the moment she stepped through the gate, she began looking around with the calculating eyes of someone adding figures in her head. Camille followed behind her mother, dressed with careful elegance, carrying a box of store-bought pastries and smiling at everyone she passed. Josephine had arrived early. Her sleeves rolled up as she helped set the tables, carried dishes, and poured water for the aunts on her husband's side. Vera told her several times to sit down and rest, but she only smiled and said she was used to keeping her hands busy. In the middle of the gathering, Vera opened the wooden box resting on the living room table, took out the old onyx ring, and told several relatives the story of the family's great-grandmother, of the years of hunger, and of the hands of one woman that had kept an entire family standing. She said that by tradition, the ring now belonged to her daughter-in-law, but Josephine was afraid of losing it, so whenever there was a family occasion, she asked Vera to keep it with the other heirlooms in the wooden box. Then Vera placed it back inside, closed the lid, and left the box on the table amid the murmurs of admiration. Camille stood only a few steps away, still holding her glass of water, her eyes never leaving the box. When everyone began moving toward the backyard to watch the children play, she said she felt a little dizzy and wanted to remain inside for a while. Patricia gave her daughter one quick glance, then turned away and continued talking with the other women. The living room was empty for less than 3 minutes, and that was all the time required. When everyone came back inside for the meal, Josephine was carrying a tray out of the kitchen, while her light coat still hung over the back of the chair where she had left it upon arriving. Dinner proceeded peacefully, until Vera suddenly remembered the ring and told her daughter-in-law to wear it home that day, saying that when the family gathered, they ought to honor the occasion properly. She opened the wooden box, and her hand stopped. The box was empty. The entire table fell silent. Vera asked once more who had touched the box. No one answered. Someone suggested that perhaps she had put the ring somewhere else and forgotten, but Vera said she had never once forgotten that ring in 40 years. Just as the tension became as tight as a drawn string, Camille rose to retrieve her own coat, which had been hanging beside her sister's. She picked up the wrong one, gave a small cry, and said, "Oh, why is there something hard in your pocket?" Before Josephine could reach her, Camille turned the pocket upside down over the table. The onyx ring fell out, rolled once, and came to rest between the plates. Several of the aunts cried out at the same time. Patricia sprang to her feet, raised a hand to her mouth, and exclaimed, "Dear God, what have you done?" Her voice trembled exactly like that of a mother whose heart had just been broken by her own child. She said she had taught Josephine better than this, that decent people had invited them into their home. Josephine stood frozen, the tray still in her hands. She looked at the ring lying in the middle of the table, then turned toward her sister, and in that very brief moment, she caught Camille's eyes. There was no panic in them, only the quiet anticipation of someone watching a card she had just turned over. Josephine set down the tray and said, "I didn't take it." Her voice wasn't loud, and it didn't tremble. Every word was simply clear. One of the aunts immediately asked whether the ring had crawled into Josephine's pocket by itself. Camille said perhaps her sister had only meant to take it home for a closer look, because Josephine wasn't truly that kind of person. The sentence was more poisonous than a direct accusation, because it appeared to pardon her while fastening the guilt onto her all the same. Vera said nothing for a long while. She picked up the ring, gently wiped imaginary dust from the dark stone, then looked at Josephine. That look was what made Josephine's heart tighten, because there was no anger in it, only a flicker of doubt, a silence that had never existed between them since the wedding day. Vera said that it was a family matter, and there was no need to make it larger than it was. Then she returned the ring to the box, closed the lid, and the meal dissolved into discomfort. By the time Elias arrived, almost everyone had already left. He heard what had happened from an aunt who had remained behind. His expression didn't change at all. He asked only 2 questions: who had found the ring, and how many people had been in the room at the time. They answered him, and he nodded without saying anything more. That night, as the pickup carried them home, Josephine stared through the window into the darkness and said only one thing: "I didn't take it." She didn't explain. She didn't plead. Elias kept both hands steady on the wheel and remained silent for a long stretch of road before answering, "I know." She turned to look at him. Those 2 words were almost weightless, yet they were the only thing that kept her from breaking apart that night. On the other side of town, Camille sat in her car, opened her phone, and sent her mother a brief message saying that the first step was complete and that everything was only beginning. The matter seemed to have ended at the dinner table that day, but in truth, it had only just begun to spread. Only a few days later, when Josephine went to help in the kitchen at the restaurant outside town, she noticed that people stopped talking whenever she entered, then resumed the moment she turned her back. One of her husband's aunts met her at the market, gripped her hand tightly, and said, "It's all right, child. Everyone falls on hard times." The pity in her voice choked Josephine more deeply than any insult could have. She only smiled, thanked the woman, and continued on her way, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket until her knuckles turned white. She had thought again and again about how she might clear her name, but the more she considered it, the more she understood that she had nothing in her hands. No one had seen Camille remain alone in the living room. No one had noticed where her coat had been hanging. And the only person who could testify that Josephine hadn't stepped into the living room at any point that afternoon was her own sister. She also understood something even more bitter. If she stood up now and accused Camille of slipping the ring into her coat pocket, then in the eyes of her husband's family, she would look like nothing more than a woman caught in the act who had turned around and blamed her own sister. Nothing diminished a person faster than watching them struggle desperately against an accusation, and Josephine knew she couldn't allow herself to struggle. The following week, she continued visiting Vera's house as she always had. She still brought food. She still sat with her on the porch shelling beans. But everything had changed. Vera remained kind and continued asking after her, yet the wooden box was no longer left on the table. Once, Josephine happened to pass the inner room and saw Vera opening the cabinet. Vera's hand stopped, and she closed the door 1 beat more slowly than usual. It was only 1 beat, but Josephine felt it as clearly as a door slamming shut in her face. She stood motionless in the hallway for several seconds, then returned to the kitchen and continued washing the dishes. Her tears fell into the basin and disappeared into the water where no one could see them. By the time she lifted the basket of clean dishes, her face was dry and her back was straight. One afternoon, Vera herself finally spoke. She asked Josephine to sit down and said she had lived long enough to know that poverty could drive people to do things they would never ordinarily do. She told her that if she lacked anything, she only needed to tell her, and that she wouldn't be angry. Josephine sat in silence for a long time, and that kind statement from her mother-in-law became the sharpest blade of all those difficult days, because it meant Vera believed she had taken the ring and had simply chosen to forgive her. Josephine raised her eyes and looked directly into Vera's. "I didn't take that ring. I haven't touched it since the day you put it back in the box. I know this has placed you in a difficult position, and I know I have nothing that can prove what I'm saying, so I won't ask you to believe me. I only ask that you don't forget too quickly what kind of person I am." Vera looked at her for a long while. Her lips moved as though she meant to say something, but then she stopped herself. In the end, she only placed her hand over Josephine's and told her to go home and rest, because night was coming. On the walk back, along the dirt road beneath the fading afternoon light, Josephine finally allowed the tears to fall. She walked slowly and didn't wipe them away, letting the wind dry her face before she reached the house. Elias came home late that evening. He found the food still warm, the house kept spotless and quiet, and his wife sitting upright at the table just as she did every day. He asked how her day had been. She said it had been ordinary. He asked whether his mother had said anything. She replied that Vera had been very kind. It was the neat, careful way she answered that made him set down his chopsticks. He told her that if someone had hurt her, she should say so. She remained silent for a moment, then asked the question she had been carrying inside herself for days. If one day the whole world said I was a bad person, and I had nothing in my hands to prove otherwise, who would you believe? Elias looked at her for a very long time. He didn't answer with a promise. He only said that he didn't believe the stories people told. He believed only what he discovered for himself. Then he added that whatever happened always left a trace behind. No one ever covered their tracks perfectly. People simply hadn't looked closely enough yet. There was something cold and certain in those words that made Josephine lift her eyes toward her husband, and for the first time, she realized that the man sitting across from her hadn't said them merely to comfort her. That night, she lay facing the wall, thinking about the look in her sister's eyes when the ring rolled into the middle of the table. Thinking about the cabinet door her mother-in-law had closed one beat too slowly, and she understood that some fractures, once they appeared, couldn't be erased by kindness or gentle words. They could only be erased by the truth, and the truth was still held in the hands of the person who had created the entire deception. While Josephine was learning to live with the looks people gave her in Hollow Creek, more than an hour's drive away, inside the high-rise apartment Camille had once shown off in photographs to all her friends, everything was beginning to fracture in a very different way. It started with the phone calls. They came during dinner, before dawn, and even in the middle of afternoons when Preston was stretched out on the couch. Each time, he carried the phone onto the balcony, closed the glass door behind him, spoke rapidly, then returned with a strained smile and said it was nothing more than some minor trouble with a project. At first, Camille believed him. Then she began counting, and she realized there had been 9 such calls in a single week. One day, while her husband was in the shower, she picked up his phone and saw a message appear on the screen from an unknown number. It contained only a few words. "This is the last time. After this, don't blame us." She put the phone down, her heart pounding, and when Preston came out, she asked him directly whom he owed money to. He laughed and said that everyone in business ran short of capital sometimes. Then he spoke the sentence she would later hear over and over until it nearly drove her mad. He had a major contract that was about to close. He only needed another 2 weeks, and everything would be fine. Those 2 weeks passed, followed by another 2 weeks, and she began to realize that the phrase returned as regularly as the hands of a broken clock. No contract was ever signed. There were only new names calling his phone. The first time her credit card was declined happened at a restaurant. She told the server to run it again, but the woman still shook her head. Preston laughed it off, said the bank had frozen the account by mistake, then pulled out cash to pay. But Camille had already seen that only a few bills remained in his wallet. The following week, she came home and found their parking space in the garage completely empty. She called her husband, and he said the car had been taken in for maintenance. 3 days later, it still hadn't returned. When she asked again, he snapped and demanded to know whether she could ever be quiet. It was the first time he had raised his voice at her since their wedding day. That night, she sat alone in the dark apartment, looking out at the city below, remembering the day her entire family had gathered around that gleaming sports car in admiration, remembering the way her mother had said that Camille was the daughter who knew how to choose well. She picked up her phone and called Patricia, trying to sound as normal as possible as she said that Preston had been rather busy lately. Patricia heard nothing unusual in her voice. She merely told Camille that she needed to know how to hold on to her husband, that men involved in important business needed to be left alone. Then she immediately changed the subject. She said the Marchetti family was still whispering about the ring, that everyone stared at Josephine whenever she went out now, and then she laughed. The sound of that laughter coming through the phone sent a chill down Camille's spine, because she suddenly realized that she was sitting in the darkness of an apartment she might soon lose, listening to her mother take pleasure in destroying the sister who had a warm home of her own. A few days later, 2 unfamiliar men came to the door. They were polite and well-dressed. They didn't raise their voices. They only asked whether Preston was home and left behind an envelope. When Camille opened it, she found a copy of a promissory note with a figure so large that she had to count the digits twice. She held on to it until her husband returned, and when he walked through the door, she placed the document on the table and asked what it was. Preston looked at it. His face went pale for a single second, before his fear immediately turned into anger. He demanded to know who had given her permission to open something that belonged to him. She said the men had placed it directly in her hands. They knew she was his wife. Only then did Preston collapse into a chair and bury his head in his hands. He said he was handling it, that several people were about to transfer money to him, and that he only needed a few weeks. Camille asked what his construction company had ever actually built. Preston jerked his head up and stared at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before. It wasn't shame. It was fear. In a very quiet voice, he told her never to ask that question again. Not of him, and not of anyone else. He warned her not to search through any of the papers in that apartment, because there were certain people whose attention she never wanted to attract, and once they noticed her, she wouldn't want her name appearing anywhere at all. Those words left Camille sitting in silence, long after her husband had disappeared into the bedroom. She looked around the luxurious apartment at all the things she could no longer be certain would still belong to her in a few days, and a small, bitter thought slipped into her mind. Perhaps everything she had sacrificed, Everything she had done to her own sister had ultimately purchased nothing more than an empty shell. Yet instead of regret, what rose inside her was a choking fury, because if her own life was collapsing, she couldn't bear the thought that the sister she had always believed herself superior to might continue living peacefully in that little house in Hollow Creek. The woman was waiting in the lobby on a Saturday morning, wrapped in an oversized sweater and holding a cloth bag in her arms, and when Camille stepped out of the elevator, the woman called her by name. Camille stopped and asked who she was. The woman said her name was Bianca, and said she was asking for only 5 minutes, no more. Camille was about to walk past her, but Bianca added one sentence that made her stop in the middle of the lobby, that this concerned Preston, and if she didn't listen today, someone else would tell her later in a much worse way. They sat down on a long bench in the corner of the lobby. Bianca didn't waste time circling around the point. She said she had known Preston for more than 2 years, had known him from before the wedding that the entire Kessler family had proudly shown off to one another. She said that at first, she had believed everything he told her, believed that he was waiting to settle family matters, believed that the marriage was only a business arrangement, and Camille let out a dry, brittle laugh. She said she had heard every trick there was, and asked Bianca how much she wanted, but the other woman's face didn't change at all. She simply lowered the cloth bag into her lap and folded both hands in front of her stomach in a very particular way, and Camille looked down, and the next thing she had been about to say died inside her mind. Bianca said she hadn't come for money. She had come because in a few months there would be a child, and she didn't want that child growing up inside a tangle of lies, while both women were kept blind. She said she had begged Preston for months to tell the truth, and every single time he had said he only needed a few more weeks, only needed a little more time, and everything would be all right. Camille sat still, and it was that phrase, that same phrase she had heard so many times over the past months, that it had nearly driven her mad, that made her believe Bianca, not the cloth bag or the way she sat. She remained there for a long time, her hand gripping the handle of her purse, her face unchanged. Then she stood up, adjusted her clothes, and said in a voice calm, in a way that felt almost unnatural, that she thanked Bianca for telling her, that this was a matter between her and her husband, and she hoped Bianca wouldn't contact her again. Bianca looked at her for a moment, then quietly said that she felt sorry for Camille, and it was that kindness more than anything else she had just heard that wounded Camille the most, because all her life she had never been able to bear the idea that she might be the pitiable one. She rode the elevator back up, stepped into the apartment, closed the door behind her, and stood there with her back against it in the darkness for a very long time. She didn't cry. She didn't smash a single thing. She only stood there until both her legs ached with exhaustion, and in her mind every piece of it rose with terrible clarity. The sports car that had been repossessed, the promissory note inside the envelope, the frightened look on her husband's face when she asked about the construction company, and now a child on the way that wasn't hers. She remembered her mother praising her as the daughter who knew how to choose, remembered the way the entire family had surrounded her on her wedding day, and remembered the sister in the faded blouse sitting with her back straight in the middle of all those mocking laughs, the one who was supposed to have been the loser. That evening, when Preston came home, she didn't ask him a single question about Bianca. She set out dinner, sat down to eat, and smiled. It was that silence more than any quarrel that unsettled him, because Camille had decided that she wouldn't let anyone see her collapse. 2 days later, she called her mother, her voice sweet as sugar, and said that she felt the ring incident had faded much too quickly, that Josephine's mother-in-law had been angry for a few days and then let it go. She said that people believed what they heard, not what they saw, and that if someone repeated something enough times, and long enough, then anything could become the truth. Patricia was silent on the other end for a moment, then asked what Camille intended to do, and Camille answered that she wasn't planning to do anything at all. She only felt sorry for her brother-in-law, such a gentle man, while his wife was out early and back late every day, working at the restaurant, working in the fields, meeting all kinds of people. She said it in a voice as light as air, then added that her mother only needed to watch closely, because when a woman had someone else, her face somehow began to glow on its own, and how else could a woman be dirt poor and still look happy all the time? On the other end of the line, Patricia began murmuring in agreement, and when the call ended, Camille sat alone in the apartment she was about to lose, staring at the hand that no longer wore her own wedding ring, and she understood that her life had already slipped out of her grasp, but if she had to fall, she wouldn't fall alone. Patricia began by appearing in places she had never set foot in before. She went to church on Sunday morning and stayed afterward to drink coffee with several of the women from the Marchetti side of the family. She didn't say a single unkind word about her daughter. On the contrary, she sighed as though defending her. She said, "My Josephine has suffered since she was a child. She had to work night shifts, had to struggle for everything, and now she works at that restaurant outside town until late at night. The poor girl." Then she lowered her voice and added that there was only one thing that worried her. When a woman came home late every night and people kept driving her all the way to the end of the lane, the tongues of others could be very cruel. She finished with a gentle sentence, telling the women not to repeat it to anyone because she had spoken only out of concern for her daughter. Within 3 days, the story had traveled all the way around Hollow Creek exactly as she had intended. Camille carried out her part with even greater subtlety. She called one of the aunts on her sister's husband's side under the pretense of asking about her health. She spoke for a long time in a sweet, affectionate voice. Then halfway through the conversation, she hesitated, like someone who had accidentally said too much. She said there was something that had been troubling her, and that she didn't know whether she should mention it. The other day, she had stopped by the restaurant to look for her sister, but Josephine wasn't there. Someone had said she had left that afternoon with a man. The moment Camille said it, she hurried to correct herself, saying that Josephine had probably only gone to pick up supplies, and that the woman shouldn't think anything of it. Yet it was that anxious correction that convinced the listener more strongly than 100 direct accusations ever could. Camille also made certain to bring up the ring from the family gathering several times, always in the voice of someone defending her sister. She said that Josephine had only meant to take it home for a closer look that day, and that people had made far too much of it. Every time that phrase was repeated, the image of Josephine in people's minds became a little more blurred, shifting from that of an innocent woman to that of someone with an old offense that had never truly been erased. Those seeds grew quietly. People began watching her for longer whenever she passed. One aunt asked whether she had been coming home late recently. Josephine answered that the restaurant had been busy, so she had stayed behind to clean. The woman nodded thoughtfully, then turned away with a smile Josephine couldn't understand. When it came to Vera, Patricia didn't dare speak directly. She arrived with a basket of fruit, sat down, and began lamenting the hardships in her household and the burden of caring for her bedridden husband. Then she wiped away tears and said that all she wanted was for her daughter not to make a foolish mistake. She said Josephine had gone without so much since childhood that whenever she saw something bright and shining, her heart was easily tempted. Patricia said this immediately after mentioning the ring. Vera remained silent. She didn't answer with so much as a word. She only poured more water for her guest. But after Patricia left, Vera sat at the table for a long time, turning the handle of her cold cup between her fingers and staring out at the empty yard. Gideon was the most difficult person to influence. He paid no attention to gossip in the streets, but he received a call from an unknown number. The caller introduced herself as an acquaintance of the family on Elias's wife's side and said there were certain things Gideon ought to know so he could look out for his cousin. Then she carefully listed whom Josephine had met that week, where she had gone, and what time she had returned home. The details were disturbingly accurate because Camille had spent more than 2 weeks following her sister's work schedule and had mixed truth into the lie the way people watered down wine. Gideon listened to everything without interrupting once. At the end, he asked only who she was. The caller hung up. He remained seated, watching the phone screen slowly go dark, and he understood something those spreading the rumors didn't know. In his world, an anonymous call aimed at a member of the family was never a matter of petty jealousy. It always served a purpose, and that purpose was rarely centered on the woman being defamed. That evening, in the little house in Hollow Creek, Josephine served dinner as she did every day. She said the restaurant had been crowded, and that the elderly woman at the end of the road had given her several squash. She spoke with the easy voice of someone relieved to have reached the end of a long day, unaware that not far away, in 3 different houses, 3 people were carrying inside their minds the same story about a life she had never lived. She didn't know that her own mother had cried before her mother-in-law to plant a seed of doubt. She didn't know her sister had counted every evening she left work, and she didn't know that the seed was growing silently each night, waiting for someone to pour one final drop of water over it, and when that happened, what rose from the ground would no longer be merely a rumor. Gideon was the one who brought the matter to Elias. He sat beside him in the pickup at the end of the dirt road and repeated the anonymous phone call without leaving out a single detail. Then he added that people outside town were spreading the same story, and he concluded by saying that he didn't believe rumors, but he didn't like how neatly this one had been constructed. Elias listened to everything with one hand still resting on the steering wheel, and in the silence that followed, something brief passed through his chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was the cold, familiar sensation of a man who had once been betrayed by someone he trusted, a feeling he had believed he buried long ago. He knew perfectly well that it was unreasonable. He knew the woman waiting at home with his dinner was the same woman who hadn't asked a single question when his signet ring fell from his work shirt, yet the pain still struck, and that was what kept him silent longer than necessary. Then he told Gideon not to do anything. Don't deny the rumors. Don't search for the caller. Let them keep talking. Gideon turned to look at him and asked what he intended to do. Elias replied that anyone who invented a story always waited to see whether people believed it. If he reacted, they would stop here. But if he appeared to believe it, they would continue, and they would reveal themselves only when they thought they were winning. Gideon remained silent for a moment, then asked whether Elias understood the cost of doing that, and who would be forced to pay it. Elias gave no answer. From that day onward, the little house in Hollow Creek began to grow colder by degrees. He still came home on time, still ate the food she prepared, and still asked how her day had been. But his questions became shorter, and the silences between them grew longer. His habit of sitting down simply to watch her cook disappeared. Sometimes she turned and found him standing in the doorway, watching her. But when she smiled, he merely nodded and went outside to the porch. Josephine didn't understand what was happening. At first, she thought he was tired. Then she assumed something had gone wrong with his work. She cooked the dishes he liked, kept his portion warm, and adjusted the lamp to make the room brighter. Each time, she noticed him staring at the empty table for a long while before looking away. One evening, she asked him directly whether she had done something wrong. Elias said no. She asked why he hadn't been speaking to her lately. He replied that he had many things to think about. She stood there with the dish towel still in her hand, then said very softly that she wasn't afraid of poverty, and she wasn't afraid of what people said, but she was afraid of sitting at the same table with someone and feeling as though she were sitting alone. Elias looked up at her, and in that exact moment, he nearly told her everything. He nearly told her about the anonymous call, about what people were saying, and about who he truly was. But then he thought that if he revealed it now, whoever stood behind the rumors would immediately retreat, and the woman accused of stealing the ring would carry that stain for the rest of her life without ever being able to clear her name. So he only said that she should continue living exactly as she always had, and not change anything. He knew the words were cruelly cold to the woman standing before him, and after several seconds, she merely nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. In the days that followed, she began noticing strange things. One evening, when she returned late from work, she saw the pickup parked at the crossroads not far from the restaurant, but by the time she approached, he had already driven away. Another time, she told him about her day at the restaurant, and he questioned her carefully about the hours, about who had driven her home. She answered honestly that the restaurant owner's son had taken her part of the way because it was raining, and she watched Elias nod. He didn't become angry. He didn't ask anything more. He merely recorded the information in his mind, in the same way a person entered a figure into a ledger, and that attitude chilled her more deeply than any argument could have. That night, she lay facing the wall and listened to him sitting outside on the porch until very late. For the first time since coming there, she wondered whether that man had ever truly chosen her, or whether all those mornings over coffee, all the times he had said that he simply liked sitting there and watching her, had only been part of something she had never been allowed to understand. Outside on the porch, Elias sat in the darkness, with the signet ring clenched tightly in his palm, counting the days until the person behind it all grew impatient, because he understood a rule that had never failed him in his entire life. When someone created a lie and didn't see the victim collapse, they always struck again, and the next time, they would go too far. Camille waited exactly 10 days, and when nothing happened, when there was no argument, no rumor silenced, she understood that words alone had reached their limit. What she needed now was something people could hold in their hands. She searched through her phone and found the photographs she had secretly taken while standing outside the restaurant. One showing Josephine bending closer beneath the rain-soaked awning to hear something the owner's son was saying. Another taken from a distance as he handed her sister a raincoat. Then Camille spent the entire evening cutting and rearranging the images, removing the space between them, removing the restaurant owner who had been standing right beside them, until all that remained was a single frame in which the two appeared to be standing close together beneath the rain. She printed it, slipped it into an unmarked envelope, And the following afternoon, that envelope was left on the front step of the little house in Hollow Creek. Elias was the one who found it. He opened it and stared at the photograph for a long time, and for a lingering second, something inside his chest tightened so fiercely that even he was caught by surprise. He had spent his entire life in a world built on deception and carefully staged appearances. He immediately noticed the clumsy cut along the edge of the raincoat, the shadows that didn't match, and the unmistakable fact that the photograph had been altered. But the pain came from somewhere else. It came from knowing that someone had spent hours creating a weapon meant to destroy the woman cooking dinner inside that house, and that he, a man with enough power to end everything with a single phone call, had chosen to stand still and watch it happen. That evening, when she set dinner on the table, he placed the photograph between them and said nothing. Josephine looked down and froze, the bowl still in her hands. She said it wasn't what it looked like. It had been raining that day. The restaurant owner had been standing right beside her. Her son had only handed her a raincoat. Her voice began to tremble as she said Elias could go to the restaurant and ask anyone. Everyone had been there. Everyone had seen what happened. After a silence so long it became difficult to breathe, Elias looked at the photograph in heavy silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, but the cold distance in his eyes cut deeper than any argument. When Josephine tried to explain, he merely set the photo down and told her he needed time to think. Heartbroken that the man she trusted hadn't instantly stood by her, Josephine packed her small bag at dawn and walked out the door, believing her marriage had truly come to an end. Josephine had nowhere to go except her parents' old house, and she intended only to stop long enough to collect a few belongings before finding a room to rent outside town. She arrived close to noon, while Patricia was away, and the house was so quiet that the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. She passed the inner bedroom and was about to continue when a hoarse, broken voice came from inside, calling her name. Raymond lay there, thinner than he had been the last time she came home, one side of his body still unable to move, but his eyes were frighteningly alert. He looked at the cloth bag hanging from her shoulder, then struggled to raise the hand he could still move and motioned for her to come closer. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, took that hand in hers, and told him not to worry, that she had only come back to collect a few things. He shook his head very slowly, then began to speak, one word at a time, each one distorted, forcing him to stop and draw breath between them. He told her not to leave, that things weren't the way she thought they were. She leaned closer so she could hear, and he continued, saying that he had heard everything, every night. The living room was separated from his bed by only one thin wall, and her mother and sister seemed to believe that a man who couldn't move was also a man who couldn't hear. He said he had heard Camille talking about the ring before the family gathering. He had heard her tell Patricia that it would take only one incident for Josephine's husband's entire family to look at her differently for the rest of her life. He had heard her mother ask whether that was going too far, and he had heard his youngest daughter laugh and answer that Josephine could bear it, because Josephine could bear anything. Those words made Josephine release her father's hand for a single second. Then he continued with even greater difficulty, saying that afterward he had heard them discussing exactly what should be said, who should hear it, and where it should be told. He had heard her mother instruct Camille not to speak badly of Josephine, but to pretend to defend her, because that was how people would believe the story. And a few nights earlier, he had heard the printer running in the outer room for a long time after midnight. The next morning, he had seen Camille carrying an envelope before driving away early. He said he had tried to call out, but no one heard him. He had reached for the telephone, but it fell to the floor, and he had lain there the entire morning staring at it, only an arm's length away, unable to pick it up. Then he began to cry. The tears of a man who could no longer move half his body rolled sideways across his hollow cheeks. He said he had remained silent his entire life. Even on her wedding day, he had done nothing but sit there and sigh. He had allowed them to marry her off as though they were handing away a debt, and now, when he finally wanted to speak, he could barely force the words out. Josephine wrapped her arms around her father, and in that small room heavy with the smell of medicine, father and daughter wept together. She no longer cried from pain, but from relief, because for the first time in her life, someone in that family had told her that she hadn't done anything wrong. Raymond tightened his fingers around hers and told her she had to go and tell her husband. She shook her head and said Elias wouldn't believe her. He had already seen the photograph. Then she repeated the cold words Elias had spoken the night before. Raymond listened and remained silent for a very long time. Then he said something that made her raise her head. He said he didn't know what kind of man her husband was, But a man who truly believed his wife had betrayed him would break something, shout, or throw her out. He wouldn't sit quietly, speak a single sentence, and then allow her to walk out the door on her own. A man like that wasn't angry, Raymond said. A man like that was planning. Josephine sat motionless, because she suddenly remembered the way Elias had clenched both hands beneath the table, the way he had studied the photograph for only 3 breaths before setting it down, and the way he hadn't asked her a single question afterward, not one, as though he had already known the answer. She remembered the crossroads where his pickup had been parked in the rain, the phone calls at 2 a.m, and the heavy signet ring resting in her slender hands. A vague thought began to take shape inside her, that perhaps she had never understood the man she married as well as she believed she had. At that moment, the sound of a car came from outside. Patricia had returned. Raymond tightened his grip on his daughter's hand and hurriedly spent what little breath he had left, telling her not to say anything to her mother, not to let anyone know he had spoken. He told her to leave, to get away from that house, and then find a way to speak to her husband. He said he was sorry. He was sorry. He repeated it 3 times. Josephine bent down, kissed her father's forehead, wiped away her tears, rose, and lifted the cloth bag onto her shoulder. When she stepped into the living room, Patricia was standing there, staring at the bag on her daughter's shoulder. She curled her lip and asked whether Josephine had been thrown out and sent crawling home again. Josephine stopped and looked at her mother for a very long time, so long that Patricia was forced to turn her face away. Then Josephine said only one thing. "I know everything, Mother." She walked straight through the door, leaving behind a woman frozen in the middle of a house that had already begun to collapse around her. The morning after Josephine walked away down the dirt road, Elias didn't go looking for her. Instead, he did something else. He called Gideon to the house and placed the photograph on the table, pointing to the cropped edge of the raincoat, the shadow falling against the direction of the sunlight, and the blurred outline where a third person had been removed from the frame. He said whoever created it wasn't a professional. They had used ordinary software, printed it at home, and stood close enough to take the original pictures, which meant they had been following her for days. Gideon asked where he wanted to begin. Elias replied that they would begin where there was always a trail, with the money. Over the next 2 weeks, the old pickup was rarely seen in Hollow Creek. No one in town knew what was happening beyond their sight. One of Gideon's men reconstructed Camille's entire schedule through gasoline receipts and security footage from stores along the road leading to the restaurant where Josephine worked. And on 3 separate afternoons, Camille's car had been parked by the roadside at precisely the time Josephine's shift ended. Another man traced the anonymous call made to Gideon. The number had come from a pay-as-you-go card purchased with cash at a small supermarket, and the woman who paid for it had been captured clearly by a security camera. Blonde hair, a light-colored coat, and the same purse she carried everywhere. Those fragments alone weren't enough to prove anything. But when Gideon placed a copy of the financial records from Preston Vance's shell construction company on the table, the full picture finally emerged. During the previous 3 months, while creditors were calling and the car was being repossessed, small but regular payments had continued flowing into Camille's personal account, and the most recent transfer had been sent exactly 2 days before the envelope appeared on Elias's doorstep. Elias studied the figure for a long time, then said she hadn't invented this entire scheme on her own. Someone was paying her. Gideon asked who. Elias replied that this was the right question, because Preston had no money to pay anyone. He was only the hand. The mind belonged to whoever was feeding money through him, and that person had begun to feel afraid. They knew someone was getting close, so they needed a reason to drive Elias out of the area. They needed him distracted. They needed the family he had married into to fall apart. The campaign against Josephine had never been merely a matter of jealousy between 2 sisters. It was a diversion, and Camille, with her bitterness already waiting to be used, was simply the cheapest tool they could find. Gideon sat quietly for a while, then said that if this was true, all they needed to do was reveal the evidence and bring the matter to an end. Elias shook his head. He said that if they exposed it now, Camille would deny everything. Her mother would cry, Preston would blame an accountant, and the person behind them would disappear. Meanwhile, the accusations of theft and adultery would cling to his wife for the rest of her life. He said people only truly destroyed themselves when they confessed with their own mouths in front of everyone they had tried to deceive. To make that happen, they had to be allowed to believe they had won. The plan was constructed over 3 days. First, Elias allowed the rumors to keep spreading. He didn't correct anyone. He even made certain people saw his pickup parked outside the tavern beyond town, and saw him sitting alone there until very late. That was all Hollow Creek needed, before everyone began telling one another that the farmer had thrown his wife out, and that the marriage was over. The news reached Patricia first and Camille afterward, and exactly as Elias had expected, they didn't stop. They pushed further. Camille began calling the women on her sister's husband's side of the family to say how ashamed she felt on Josephine's behalf. Second, Gideon carefully allowed word to spread that the Marchetti family would soon hold a grand gathering in the city, an occasion where the family intended to make an important announcement and relatives from both sides would be invited. An invitation printed on thick, embossed paper was delivered directly into Patricia's hands, and she held it with fingers trembling from delight. She immediately called her youngest daughter and said Josephine's husband's family had invited all of them, which meant they still considered the Kesslers important, which meant the unpleasant matter had already been forgiven. Camille was silent on the other end for a moment, before saying that Patricia should arrive early and that she would come with Preston. Third, and this was the part known only to Elias and Gideon, an invitation was also sent to Preston with a message stating that the Marchetti family wished to discuss a possible partnership in the construction industry, an opportunity that a man drowning in debt could never refuse. As Gideon signed the final invitation for delivery, he looked up and asked whether Elias was certain Josephine would come. Elias stared through the window for a long time before saying that she would, not because of him, but because her father would be brought there, and the old man was the only person in her family who had never truly abandoned her. Gideon shook his head and said Elias had accounted even for that. Elias replied that he had to, because this was the last time he would ever be allowed to make a mistake. Then he rose, removed the signet ring from the pocket of his work shirt, and for the first time in months, slid it onto his finger. The dark metal closed around his knuckle like a door slamming shut. He told Gideon to have everyone prepared for Saturday night, with no one missing. Then he added very quietly that people who created lies always believed they were more clever than everyone else, and that was precisely why they always lost. On Saturday night, a line of cars rolled into the gravel courtyard before a building so vast that Patricia had to tilt her head back to take it all in. And when she stepped out in the finest dress she owned, she immediately felt how cheap it looked among the people moving past her. Camille had her arm looped through Preston's, and the two of them smiled and nodded to unfamiliar faces, neither of them understanding why people at the gate already knew their names and were ushering them inside. Beyond the entrance stretched a soaring hall lit by rows of crystal chandeliers, with servers gliding through the room as quietly as shadows. And what unsettled Patricia most wasn't the luxury itself, but the way everyone here spoke in lowered voices, as though in a room like this, loudness belonged only to those with no standing at all. She tugged at her daughter's hand and whispered whether her in-laws were truly this wealthy. And Camille answered that they'd probably borrowed the venue. No sooner had she said it than Gideon appeared, no longer wearing the dark coat of a cousin who dropped by a farmhouse, but dressed in formal evening clothes, standing straight, and bowing to Patricia with a politeness so perfect it felt almost chilling. He said that she and her family were invited in, that their places had been prepared in the front row. Preston looked at Gideon and quietly asked whether they had met somewhere before, but Gideon only smiled and said perhaps he was mistaken, then led the whole family through the center of the room. The farther they walked, the stranger Patricia felt, because the guests lining either side kept stepping back to clear the way, not for her, but for someone behind them. Then the music softened, and at the far end of the hall, a door opened. Camille was the first to recognize him, and she went utterly still with a glass of wine in her hand, because the man walking toward them looked nothing like the farmer in the rusted pickup truck her family had once mocked behind cupped hands. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, tailored to perfection over broad shoulders, with a signet ring of heavy dark steel gleaming on his finger. Surrounding him were dozens of sharp-eyed men in fitted black coats, guards who stood at absolute attention, blocking every exit with silent, lethal precision. As he walked, powerful figures, city councilors, and underground syndicate bosses lowered their heads in deep, fearful deference, whispering the title Don Marchetti in hushed tones, only that it made people lower their voices even further. Elias passed the place where the Kessler family stood without pausing. He walked up the small platform at the front of the room, then turned and looked down, and Patricia saw a dark ring on his finger catching the light like a cold streak of metal. Vera came to stand beside her son, and in that instant the master of ceremonies began to speak, introducing the hosts of the evening, the Marchetti family, and its head, Elias Marchetti. The name dropped into the hall like a stone into still water. Patricia staggered and had to grip the back of a chair. She turned to her younger daughter and asked in a voice gone strange who that man was, but Camille couldn't answer. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, and Preston had gone white as paper. He stepped back half a pace, his eyes darting around in search of an exit, and all at once he understood that the invitation about a construction partnership delivered into his hands a few days earlier had never been an opportunity at all. Elias began to speak. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He thanked everyone for coming and said that his family had never been fond of display. But tonight there were certain matters that needed to be spoken aloud before a crowd, because there were truths that, if spoken only in private, remained rumors forever. Then he paused and let his gaze travel across the room, and it came to rest on the front row, where a wheelchair had just been rolled in. Raymond sat there, brought in earlier that afternoon by one of Gideon's men, a blanket draped across his legs, his face hollowed with illness but his eyes blazing bright, and standing behind the chair, both hands resting on the handles, was Josephine. She wore a simple dark dress, her hair pinned neatly up, with no jewelry and no carefully painted face, and she stood with her back straight exactly the way she had stood on her wedding day in the middle of all those mocking laughs. The entire room turned to look at her. Patricia opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Camille took a step back and struck the table behind her, making several glasses clink against one another. And in that moment, all the pieces the two women had spent months arranging suddenly became frighteningly fragile, because the woman they had defamed was standing here, not cast out, not hanging her head, but beside the very father they had left behind in a room beyond a thin wall. Elias looked at Josephine for a long time, and in those gray-blue eyes so used to reading the truth in other people, there was something the entire room could see, and yet no one could quite name. Then he went on, saying that over the past months there had been a woman living in the poorest house in Hollow Creek, with a man she believed was a farmer, that she had never once asked him how much money he had, never demanded a single thing, and that when the whole town called her a thief, she had still kept her back straight. He said he had remained silent for too long, and tonight he would return to her everything people had taken away from her, one thing at a time, before the very people who had taken it. And the moment those words were spoken, the lights in the hall blazed brighter, the doors behind them swung shut, and Camille suddenly understood that, throughout the entire evening, no one in that room had been standing in front of the exits, because there was no longer any way out at all. Gideon stepped forward and placed a thick file on the white-draped table in the center of the hall, and Elias began with what he called the smallest matter, the ring. He revealed that after the incident, Gideon had secretly retrieved and restored the hidden surveillance footage from a concealed camera inside the residence. A screen lit up behind him, displaying the exact moment Camille entered the empty room, opened the wooden box, picked up the onyx ring, walked directly to the light coat hanging over the back of a chair, and slipped it into the pocket. A long murmur swept through the hall. Several of the Marchetti aunts rose abruptly to their feet. Vera closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them again, while Camille stood gripping the back of her chair, her face drained white beneath the lights. She stammered that the woman in the recording wasn't her, that the image was too blurred, and Elias answered with only one sentence. He had the original, and it was much clearer, but he didn't wish to show it there, because her entire face could be seen. He said he had chosen to leave her a small measure of dignity, far less than what she had taken from her sister. Then he moved to the second matter, the photograph. He lifted it for everyone to see, pointing out the cut along the edge of the raincoat, the sunlight casting shadows in the wrong direction, and beside it, Gideon placed the unaltered original showing the restaurant owner standing directly between the two people beneath the rain-soaked awning. Elias added that the woman herself was present that evening, and at the far end of the hall, the restaurant owner rose and nodded in confirmation. He said the false photograph had been printed in the Kessler family home at midnight, and that he even had the receipt for the printer ink and the name under which it had been purchased. By then, Patricia had begun trembling violently. She turned toward her younger daughter and asked what she had done, using the same falsely horrified voice she had used when the ring rolled into the middle of the dining table. Elias stared at her for a long time, then told her to stop performing. He nodded once, and Gideon played an audio recording. Patricia's voice filled the silent hall, telling her daughter not to speak badly of Josephine, but to pretend to defend her because that was how people would believe the story. Patricia collapsed into her chair and covered her face with both hands. Elias said the recording hadn't been obtained through secret surveillance. It had been recorded by a hidden device placed in her own home by Gideon's men, capturing every conversation Patricia and Camille had behind those thin walls. In the front row, Raymond lifted his head, his eyes wet but his gaze unwavering. Then came the final matter. Elias turned toward Preston and said that now they had reached the business of adults. He said that the construction company bearing Preston's name had never built so much as a single wall, yet over the previous 3 years, an enormous flow of money had passed through it. Gideon began placing copies on the table one by one, account numbers, dates, times, signatures. Preston gave a bitter laugh and said those papers proved nothing. Elias replied that he was right. They proved only that Preston had received the money. The evidence showing whom he had sold belonged somewhere else. Elias raised 3 sheets of paper and said they contained 3 schedules that had been leaked over the past 6 months. Then he added that the final schedule had never truly existed. Only one copy had been written, and it had been given to one person alone. 4 days later, it appeared unchanged in the hands of their rival. The hall fell silent. Preston stepped backward, his eyes darting around the room. Elias said there was no need for him to deny anything, because the man to whom he had passed the information was also sitting in that very hall. Elias spoke the man's name directly. A man seated at a table near the back rose, as though preparing to leave, but 2 of Gideon's men were already standing on either side of him. No one touched him. No one raised a voice. They simply stood there, and the man slowly sat back down, his face gray with fear. Elias stared down at Preston with icy indifference, his voice dropping into a tone that carried the heavy weight of an absolute death sentence. "I don't need police or courts to deal with rats, Preston," Elias said softly, the silence in the hall echoing his every word. "By sunrise, every syndicate, every shadow account, and every family from here to the coast will know you are a marked traitor. You will not own a single cent, a single acre, or a single dark alleyway in this city to hide in. I have stripped your name from the living." Preston began stammering that he had been forced, that he had only borrowed money to pay his debts. Camille burst into tears and called her husband's name. At that moment, a woman in an oversized sweater rose from the far end of the hall. Bianca stepped forward and said very little. She only said she had come because she didn't want to live inside a lie for one more day. When Camille saw her, the sound of her crying died in her throat. By then, everyone in the hall understood the entire truth. The people who had once listened to stories about the thieving daughter-in-law now stood with their eyes lowered toward the floor. One of the aunts quietly approached Josephine and took her hand, unable to find a single word. Vera came forward, removed the onyx ring from its box, took her daughter-in-law's calloused hand, and placed the ring on her finger before everyone. She said that she had allowed doubt to enter her heart, even if only for a single moment, and asked Josephine to forgive her. Then Elias stepped down from the platform, crossed the crowded hall, and stopped before his wife. And in the eyes of the man who had never lost to anyone in his life, everyone present saw for the first time something that looked very much like fear. They left the great hall through a small door, leading into a private reading room, where there was only a single desk lamp, and the noise of the gathering was sealed away behind the thick door. Josephine stood with her back to him for a long time, both hands wrapped around her own elbows. Then she said that she wanted to ask him only one question. Why had he married her in the first place? Elias answered that he would tell her everything without hiding a single word. And he did. He told her about the traitor within his family, about the trail of money that had led to a shell company bearing Preston Vance's name, and about how he needed to remain close enough to hear the things he could never have heard from a distance. He said he had chosen the Kessler family before he knew who she was, that he had once sat inside a car parked across the road from the cannery where she worked the night shift, and that she had been the last person to come out after everyone else had gone, carrying 2 bags of leftover food the kitchen woman had given her. He had looked at her and thought that this woman would surely agree to marry anyone willing to pay off her father's debts. Josephine turned around, her eyes red with tears, and said that meant she had been nothing more than another link in his calculations from the very beginning. Elias said yes, and that it was the worst thing he had ever done in his life. He said he had calculated everything correctly except her, because of all the women who had ever entered his life. Not one had agreed to stand beside a man who appeared to have nothing. They had only come after learning who he was. But she had accepted an old ring while her entire family laughed at her, and she had still stood with quiet dignity. He said he had told himself he was testing her heart, But the truth was that he had been testing his own. He had been afraid enough to become cruel, afraid that one day she would learn who he was, and the look in her eyes would change, just as it had in the eyes of everyone before her, and he had placed the weight of that fear on her shoulders. When Josephine heard that, her tears began to fall. She asked whether he remembered the night she held his signet ring in her hand, and didn't ask him a single question. She had been frightened, but she had still chosen to trust him. Yet he had placed a photograph on the table, and told her that all he could see was what lay before him. She said those words had destroyed her more deeply than anything her mother or sister had done, because they had never loved her, but he had. Elias stood there and accepted every word without defending himself. Then he stepped forward and lowered himself to his knees in the middle of the reading room. The man whose single word could freeze shipping lines and bring underground syndicates to their knees silently lowered himself to both knees in the middle of the room. The undisputed Don of the Marchetti Empire knelt humbly before a woman wearing worn shoes and a faded dress. Placing his pride entirely in her calloused hands, he told her she could remain standing and listen, but he needed to say what came next from that position. He said he had tested someone who had never been the problem. He was the problem. Josephine began to sob aloud and told him to stand up, but he shook his head. He said he knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness that night. He asked only one thing, that she not believe the months they had shared were false. He said that on the day she stood in the kitchen, stirring the pot of soup, and he pulled out a chair to watch her, he hadn't been pretending. It had been the first family meal of his life, where he hadn't needed to wonder what the people at the table were calculating. He told her that after she left, he had spent many nights staring at the lamp she had tilted, so the light would fall into the center of the room, and he hadn't dared move it back to where it had been before. Josephine wiped her face with one hand and asked in a choked voice whether he knew what she had needed throughout all 27 years of her life. It wasn't money. Her family had lacked money for as long as she could remember, but poverty had never been what brought her to her knees. What had broken her was living in a house where no one truly saw her. Her mother had looked at her as though she were a debt. Her sister had looked at her as a shadow she could stand above. Her father had lain there watching her, unable to speak. She said she had never needed Elias to be wealthy. She had only needed him to see her. Elias raised his eyes, looking up at her with the absolute devotion of a ruler yielding his crown. I have built an empire where no one can touch me. Yet I was terrified that bringing you into my world would taint the purity I saw in you, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I tried to calculate your heart like I calculate my enemies, and that was my ultimate sin. The Marchetti Empire kneels to no one, Josephine. But I kneel before you, not because I am weak, but because a man who rules the shadows is nothing without the light you brought into my life. They remained like that for a long time. Then Josephine stepped closer, bent down, placed her calloused hand on his shoulder, and told him to stand. She said she didn't want to see him kneeling, not because of who he was, but because she wasn't accustomed to seeing someone she loved beneath her. Elias rose to his feet, and she continued. She hadn't forgiven him yet. She needed time for that pain, but she wouldn't leave that night either, because if she did, she would become exactly the person they wanted her to be. She raised the hand wearing the onyx ring and studied it beneath the lamplight. She said his mother had placed that ring on her finger before everyone, but she had never asked for the Marchetti name. She asked for only one thing, that from now on, whenever something happened, he would tell her before the rest of the world knew. Elias took that hand in his and promised he would, and for the first time that entire evening, the man's voice trembled. That winter, the farmhouse in Hollow Creek was repaired, not torn down and rebuilt, but restored around its old frame. The roof was replaced, the floors were redone, and Josephine insisted on keeping the window frame fitted with the pane of glass she had received from the elderly woman at the end of the road. She said it was the first thing she had ever done for that house, so it had to remain. Raymond was brought to live with the couple, and his room was placed beside the living room, so he would always hear the sound of other people nearby. Every morning, Josephine wheeled her father onto the porch to sit in the sunlight. One day, he took his daughter's hand and, still struggling to form each word, told her that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He only wanted to say that he had been wrong for 27 years. He had remained silent when he should have spoken. Josephine bent down, placed her hand over his, and said she had forgiven him long ago, from the day he lay helpless in that bed and still tried to reach the telephone for her. She said some people lived their entire lives with strong bodies and never once stood up for anyone, while he had done everything he could with the little strength he had left. The man began to cry, and this time, his tears were tears of relief. As for those who had sown the wind, events unfolded exactly as they always do when life finally demands payment. The entire file was delivered to the proper authorities the following morning. Preston lost his company, his apartment, and the glittering shell in which he had lived for years, and he faced a long series of court proceedings. Camille divorced him quietly and moved into a friend's home. No one called her the daughter who knew how to choose anymore. She sent her sister a long letter. Josephine read every word, folded it, placed it in a drawer, and didn't reply. She told her husband that she didn't hate Camille, but she couldn't open the door again yet. Some doors needed time. Patricia found herself shunned by the very relatives whose approval she had sacrificed both daughters to gain. The reputation she had traded so much to protect dissolved like morning mist. Once, she came to Hollow Creek and stood outside the gate for a long time. Josephine went out, opened it, and invited her mother inside for a cup of tea. She didn't scold her or speak a single cruel word, and that kindness caused the woman to collapse into sobs in the middle of the kitchen she had once mocked as a leaking ruin. Vera personally arranged steady work for Bianca. She said the child, soon to be born, carried no blame for anything the adults had done, and Josephine was the one who knitted the baby's first scarf. The following spring, on a morning as ordinary as any other, Josephine stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, while Elias sat in the old chair watching her work. He rose, walked over, and stopped in front of her. He held no ring box, carried no flowers, and had no witness except her father sitting outside on the porch. He said that when she married him before, she had no other choice, but now she had every choice in the world, so he wanted to ask her again. He said he wasn't asking as a Marchetti, and he wasn't asking with houses or money. He was asking as the man standing before her. Will you stay with me? Not because of this house, not because of my name, but only because of me? Josephine set down the ladle and turned to look at her husband for a long time. Then she smiled. The eyes that had shed so many tears in silence now held a peaceful light. She answered that she had stayed a long time ago, and that had never truly been the question. She added that on the day she walked through that gate, with a cloth bag over her shoulder, she had promised herself that no matter what life took from her, she wouldn't lose herself. And now she was standing there, still herself, with only one difference. There was finally someone who saw her. At noon that day, the three of them sat down to eat at the old wooden table beneath the lamp tilted so its light fell into the center of the room. Outside the window, the wildflowers once placed in a glass jar had taken root and grown into a small patch beside the porch. And inside the house an entire town had once mocked. There was finally enough laughter to fill a real home. Because in the end, a home was never made by the car parked outside or the name a person carried. It was made by having someone willing to see us even when the whole world turned away. And if Josephine's story has touched your heart today, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more beautiful and meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, which character touched you most, and whether, in Josephine's place, you would choose forgiveness or walk away. Please leave a few words in the comments below, because every message shared from the depths of your heart is the most precious gift you can give us. We sincerely wish everyone listening to this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.